All right, we are picking up in period number 2. As I told you before, we'll go over these 12 periods several times just to make sure we refresh our memory, the 12 periods of Old Testament history. I hope this is okay because I may have forgotten to embed my fonts here, but we'll just work through it. Before the flood, period number 1, antediluvian is another name for it. Not antediluvian, of course, before the flood. This covers from creation to the flood, after the flood, or post-diluvian, from the flood to the call of Abraham, patriarchal, the call of Abraham to the death of Joseph. Then you have bondage in Exodus, the death of Joseph to the crossing of the Red Sea. Then, of course, you have wilderness wanderings. I often say it's the period that never should have been. They should have gone right into the promised land, but because of their unbelief, they wander in the wilderness for 40 years till that generation, 20 years old and upward, died out. This is from the crossing of the Red Sea to the crossing of the River Jordan, which marks the entrance into the land of Canaan. From there, you have period 6, which is conquest and possession. That'll cover crossing the Jordan River to the death of Joshua. And then you have the period of the Judges, which is approximately from the death of Joshua to the anointing of Saul as the first earthly king of Israel. The period of the United Kingdom is number 8. The anointing of Saul to the death of Solomon. Then the divided kingdom, of course, would come next, the death of Solomon to the fall of the northern kingdom at the hands of Assyria. Judah alone, this period number 10, covers from the fall of the northern kingdom to the fall of the southern kingdom at the hands of Babylon. Then you have the exile or the captivity. This is from the fall of the southern kingdom to the decree of King Cyrus of Persia that allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. And then the period of restoration. This will be from the decree of Cyrus to the end of Nehemiah's work. I think I've mentioned this before. Nehemiah and Malachi would have been, I don't know if contemporary is the right word because they didn't necessarily work together, but their work, at least chronologically, was partially contemporary. But when you study the book of Nehemiah, you see Nehemiah, in the beginning of the book, he asked for permission to go back to Judah, to Jerusalem, to rebuild the walls, and he's granted what we would call a leave from the king. But the king asked him for how long. This is not just an indefinite leave, of course. So he comes back, and at some point, we don't really have any kind of a firm idea as to how long, but at some point he goes back to Jerusalem. So in the latter part of Nehemiah, you see Nehemiah comes back, and in a very short period of time, things have kind of unraveled spiritually, and there's a great need for reform. That would really be chronologically the last of the Old Testament. So that's why we say the end of Nehemiah's work, because sometimes people say, well, didn't Nehemiah go back fairly early on and rebuild the walls, at least early on as far as the restoration? And he did, but he goes back to the king in Persia, comes back again later. Now that brings us to period number 2, which is what we're talking about today. This is the after the flood, or if you want to call it post-diluvian. Events covered in this section, we already covered on our review there. This covers from the flood to the call of Abraham. Where do we read about it in the Bible? Genesis chapters 8 through 11. We've pointed out before, some of this gets approximate just for ease of memorization and recall later as you're trying to place these periods. But the flood technically begins in chapter 7, verse 11. And if you want to get real technical, we're introduced to Abraham as we call him. His name later will be changed. And Sarai, or Sarah, his wife. We're introduced to them in chapter 11, I think it's verse 26. So technically, it's not going to go all the way through 11, but basically it does cover pretty much Genesis 8 through 11. Get over there to that section of the Bible. I'm going to double check myself on that. I think it's 26. Yeah, the chapter ends with the death of Terah, the father of Abraham. He dies in Haran. But in verse 26, Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, Haran. So sometimes we'll say a period ends in a particular chapter, and it might end technically in the middle of that chapter, but I think it's easier when you're recalling these periods. And so, again, my hope for you is, as we study this, is whenever you're talking about Abraham, you automatically think, okay, he's going to fall into that third period, patriarchal. And that helps you to get an idea of where Abraham falls in the Old Testament timeline. You don't have to memorize a ton of dates, but if you can remember what period they fall in, that will help you tremendously. You read about Noah, and okay, that's in the flood, so that's pretty early on. I know that's in at least period 1 or period 2. We're introduced to Noah in period number 1, but he's involved a lot in period 2 as well. So that's why I try to, we try to keep these chapters and some of these things a little more approximate because it helps with the memorization and recall later. Important people in this section. Well, we just mentioned one of them. Noah, obviously, is going to be an important individual in this section. Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth. Obviously, this period, it covers some time, but again, just like period 1, there's not as much here that we'll dive into as far as people and places and so on. It kind of centers around some central events. That's really it in this section. I suppose you could bring up Abraham and Sarah, but really they don't come in. We're introduced to them kind of at the tail end of this section, but they don't really come into play as important people until that third period, the patriarchal period. So I didn't include them here. The men at Babel obviously are not named, so we don't have any names to associate there. But Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, those are really your key characters in this section. Important places. Well, important places here would be the mountains of Ararat, chapter 8, verse 4. Sometimes we say the ark landed on Mount Ararat, but if you want to make sure you're saying that accurately, it technically landed on the mountains of Ararat. I don't know exactly what mount it landed on, but apparently it was a region of mountains. Years ago when I was a child, in fact, I think we watched it in a Bible class, this video that supposedly they had found the ark, and that was revealed later to be, I don't know if it was a hoax or just a misunderstanding. I'm not really sure. I can't tell you for sure on that. I don't recall, but anyways, it turned out it was not the ark at all. I think somebody, as I recall, kind of did some finagling with facts and archaeological finds and things like that. And I've said this before with other things, such as maybe anybody ever gotten the email forward? I know email forwards are not as big now, but when I was probably right around the time of preaching school, the internet was kind of getting to be a big thing, and the next year or two, maybe 5, maybe even 10 years after that, email was, people interact a lot on social media. It's not necessarily that people aren't interacting. It's just, the means come and go. But email forwards, man, they would go around, and there'd be this email forward that'd make its way around, and, so many times you'd find out it was some kind of a hoax or an urban legend or whatever, but there was one about NASA. NASA's got a missing day. Anybody ever get that one? I can't be the only one. I see John shaking his head. Miss Anita. Okay, some others. NASA's missing day and how they couldn't account for it. And it goes back and it talks about in Joshua how the sun stood still. But that still didn't quite account for it. And then you go to, what would it be, 2 Kings 20 with Hezekiah. And, Hezekiah says, well, it's no big thing if the sundial goes forward. How about, God says, ask for signs. Well, how about if the sundial goes backward a few degrees? And so there it all adds up. NASA has found this missing day, and it's right there in the Bible all along. Well, that was just completely fabricated by somebody, and it does no favors to the truth when people do that. You don't do truth any favors with falsehood. It's ridiculous. It's like being deceitful, taking a verse completely out of context to try to prove a point that you want to make. And it may be a biblical point, but using a verse out of context to prove it, that's just not honest. It's not being honest with the text, and it's not doing the truth any favors. Because what happens is, like with the missing day, so-called, is somebody gets a hold of that who's a skeptic, and they say, well, look, that was just, somebody fabricated that, they made it up, and so it just shows you trying to use that to prove the Bible doesn't prove anything. The Bible stands as, they would say, full of errors and just written by men. Well, the Bible record still stands, but it doesn't need some kind of fabricated proof. There are all kinds of evidences that are out there. We've talked before about archaeology. There's all kind of evidences out there, but there are some things. How do you prove a miracle through archaeology? How do you prove a miracle after the fact? Jesus turned water into the best grape juice anybody had ever tasted. And we talked about this some in our family Bible time last night. Jesus in John 2, they say it's the good stuff. I had somebody tell me one time that proves it was alcoholic, Chad, because they said it was the good stuff. And I said, well, you're betraying yourself, your own heart with that kind of statement. Because, yes, to a wino or somebody who's just really into drinking alcohol, the good stuff, as they say, is the most alcoholic. But to a first century person, this generic term, oinos, sometimes translated as wine, it can mean grape juice. In fact, in Isaiah, there's a reference to wine in the cluster. It's still within the grape. That's grape juice, folks. But this generic word can mean grape juice or fermented, intoxicating wine. But the good stuff to them is the freshest. They had various means of preserving it, and that's another false idea. That's another fallacy that people sometimes put out. Well, it had to be intoxicating. They had to drink it all the time intoxicating because they didn't have any way to preserve it except to ferment it and turn it into wine. Well, that's just not true. They had all kinds of ways. And there's a man, I think W.D. Jeffcoat was his name. He wrote a really, really good book, and he did a lot of research and details a lot of ways they had of preserving grape juice, which sometimes you have to reconstitute it. I used with my children the example of sometimes when somebody has taken the Lord's Supper and they leave that little cup in the little holder there in the back of the pew, and you come back a day or so later and you see that, and there maybe there was a few drops in there and you could have turned it up and poured out a few drops, but you come back a day or so later and what? You can turn it upside down, nothing happens. It's just syrup. The water has evaporated out. Well, they would do that sometimes with grape juice. Boil it down to a syrup and you reconstitute it with water. But how you reckon that tastes compared to freshly squeezed grape juice? I was telling my children last night, I've been in Costa Rica. Hayner's mom, on a couple of different occasions, has made us freshly squeezed orange juice. I'm talking she went out into the side yard, picked oranges, came in, and squeezed orange juice. And I'll tell you what, when I drank that, I said, this is the good stuff. It was better than any orange juice I've ever had, still, to this day. Well, that's what they were talking about. And so, it doesn't do truth any favors when we take verses out of context and try to make them say things that they don't say, or try to take things like, this whole finding the ark that turned out to be a hoax, this NASA's missing day, things like that. Stay honest with the text. We need to make sure we do that. Truth doesn't need falsifying of any other facts or passages to uphold it. But how do you prove a miracle like that in hindsight? Well, Jesus turns the water into this wine, again, generic term, best grape juice anybody ever had. Well, guess what they did with it? If you had the best grape juice in the world in front of you, I don't know, maybe you don't like grape juice, but what would you do with it if you like grape juice? You drink it. Now, verify that with archaeology 2,000 years later. Can't do it. Does that make it any less true? Just because we can't find some kind of concrete proof? So again, got to be honest with the text. Babel is another important place in this section. Babel is in this account is in chapter 11. The word means confusion. You probably have heard this before, but that's what the word literally means, confusion, because God confused the languages there. This is where man tried to build a tower that would reach up to heaven. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Important events in this section. Important events. When did Noah and his family leave the ark? What'd you say? Somebody said it. Somebody I think knows. I think Cindy's been in my class before. She said my kind of tongue-in-cheek answer, but it's true. What? Jimmy said it, I think, too. When God told him to, right? But when was that? Well, if you look in chapter 8, verses 15 and 16, God spake unto Noah, saying, Go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife and thy sons wives with thee. And then you drop to verse 18, Noah went forth, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. I suppose we could put Mrs. Noah as an important character in this section. We're never told anywhere her name, so I didn't include her. But Noah and his wife, you don't read really a whole lot about her except her being mentioned, so I didn't really include her in the important people. I'm not trying to say she's not important, but just not a whole lot that we know about her. But if you want a little more detail here, you can go to 13 and 14. It came to pass in the 601st year, the first month, first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dried. And in the second month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, was the earth dried. So it's the year 601, month number 2, day 27 of Noah's life. That's when they came off of the ark. They had entered the ark over a year before that, year 600, month 2, day 10. If you go back to chapter 7, when the flood begins in verse 11, 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the deep, of the great deep, broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. Somebody says, well, Chad, that says the 17th day, but you got to back up a little bit to verse 4, because God says, for yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living substance that I've made will I destroy from off the face of the earth. And then verse 10, came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. So Noah's in the ark 7 days, and then it begins on the 17th day. So he went in the ark, year 600, month 2, day 10. Again, that's approximate because remember, in the Jewish culture, this was written, this originally was written in the Torah, the Pentateuch, for the Jews as part of their law. Even a part of a day counted as a day. Because remember, Jesus was in the tomb 3 days, and yet it was Friday evening when he died. All of Saturday and early Sunday morning he rose from the dead. Sometimes skeptics have a problem with that. Again, you have to understand this was part of their culture. And if you need if there were no other evidence to show that's not any kind of discrepancy or problem, then all you have to do is look at the unbelieving Jews. They made a lot of accusations to try to discount the resurrection of Jesus, to try to argue against him as the Savior, as the Messiah, whatever. But one argument they never, ever made? Well, he said he was going to be in the tomb 3 days and nights, and only part of Friday, all day Saturday, and just a little bit of Sunday. So he's a liar. They never said that. Why? Because they knew there's nothing to that. And so for people to come along nowadays in modern culture and try to make that argument is foolish. It's utterly foolish. Even today, we sometimes say, congratulations, you've won a 3-day vacation. Well, you may not be able to get in down there and check into your hotel till 2 or 3 in the afternoon on Friday. And so you get Friday, all day Saturday, and then by 10, 11 Sunday morning, I say, you got to be checked out and go home. Well, nobody says, you bunch of liars. You said it was a 3-day vacation. I'm expecting, 72 hours? Don't ask me. I need somebody who can do math in their head. Is that right, 72 hours? I'm expecting 72 full hours this vacation. So I demand somebody make this right. We don't do that. We understand. So keep that in mind. But so somewhere around year 600, month 2, day 10, they entered into the ark. First thing Noah and his family did when they got off the ark, they worshiped God, sacrificed. He built an altar, sacrificed in worship to God. Look at verse 20 of chapter 8. Oops, I'm still in chapter 6. Noah builded an altar unto the Lord and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Sometimes I use this as kind of a pew packer's question, a couple of these. Sometimes I'll ask how long were Noah and his family on the ark? A little over a year. And another question I like to ask the young folks when I'm doing some kind of Bible trivia type questions with them is, what is the first thing Noah did? First thing Noah did when he left the ark. And the answer to that, of course, is he worshiped God. You think that tells us something about Noah, his character, his spirituality? I've known brothers and sisters in the Lord that sometimes the day of, sometimes the day after, losing a spouse, losing a child, losing someone very near and dear to them to death, they go to worship. I've even seen some situations where maybe a brother or sister in Christ says, we didn't expect to see you. We're glad to see you, but didn't really expect to. And this one brother said, where else would I be? He said, his wife was a faithful Christian, and he said, she went to be with the Lord, and I plan to go be with the Lord. And so I figure right now the nearest I can be to her is in worship to my God, coming before his throne. I thought that was pretty powerful. First thing Noah does when he comes off the ark, he's going to worship God. He understands. Can you imagine having seen what he had seen over the past year, especially as the fountains of the deep broke up and the flood began, how tumultuous that was, and knowing that God had preserved them alive and safe. And he was very grateful. And that gratitude was displayed in his worshiping God first thing when he comes off the ark. All right, continuing these important events. Wait a minute. I think I've got my PowerPoint wrong. No, I don't. I'm just forgetting. What did God say about evil in a person's heart? Look at chapter 8, verse 21. The Lord smelled a sweet savor. This is after Noah's offering, or at Noah's offering. And the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. Now notice, he doesn't say evil is in a man's heart from birth. There's this doctrine of inherited sin that is utterly false, and it's refuted numerous places through Scripture. He's not saying here that people are born evil. That would contradict so many other passages. But what he's saying is that it is from youth. Do you think that's kind of a wake-up call if we're parents? It should be. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, any opportunity, Bible class teachers, any opportunity we have to influence youth for good, we need to take advantage of that, because good thoughts, good habits, bad habits are often established very early, right? And things that are ingrained in us in our youth by training, or if lack of training, by peer influence, which serves as a form of training as well. Those things oftentimes are hard to overcome. They're hard to get rid of. So that can be a good thing if you develop good habits. I wasn't always a faithful Christian, but it was hard. I don't remember ever, even when I wasn't where I needed to be spiritually, that I just quit ever attending services. And at times, I think that was habit more than anything else. I know it was. And I'm not saying that's a good thing to be at church just out of habit, but I had developed that habit, and it kept me close enough to godly people that some people were able to influence me, and it helped to influence me back toward the right way. And I'm thankful for that. And it's because I grew up with parents who made that a priority. That was at least part of that. So the importance of training in youth is evident there. God gave special instructions to Noah and his family in chapter 9, beginning at verse 1, as far as what to eat, the shedding of blood. God blesses Noah and his sons, tells them to be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth. The fear of you, the dread of you is going to be on every beast of the earth, every fowl of the air, all that moves upon the earth, fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you. Even as the green herb have I given you all things. Seems before that they had not eaten meat. And so at least we can say that good thing came from the flood, right? We have meat now to eat. But he says, the flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall you not eat. And surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require, and at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. And you, he says to Noah and his family, be ye fruitful, and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, and multiply therein. So God gives these special instructions as far as what they're allowed to eat, and as far as the shedding of blood. Don't eat the blood. When you eat animals, that is carried over actually into the new covenant as well. You don't just eat blood. The life is in the blood, of course, but he also says, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Doesn't mean you can't have a medium rare or even a rare steak. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about actually consuming the blood. Papa tells of being in Malaysia, and one of the, they considered it kind of a delicacy, was pig blood soup. And it is exactly what it sounds like. And they considered that a big deal. It was expensive. It was kind of considered fine dining. I would not consider that fine dining. I'm a fan of bacon. I'm a fan of ham. I'm a fan of pork chops. But I have no desire to eat pig blood soup ever. But if I did, so if I'm going to be a faithful Christian, I couldn't do that. So, of course, Papa and them said even when sometimes somebody might be, a non-Christian trying to be nice and offer him something fancy, he would have to decline that and explain why. He's not trying to be rude, not trying to be unthankful. But here's why. God makes a covenant with the earth. What is the covenant? The covenant was not that he would never destroy the earth again, right? What was the covenant? Never destroy the earth again by means of a universal flood. That is the covenant. He's never going to destroy the earth again with a flood. He is going to destroy the earth one day, utterly destroy the earth. Even the elements and all that's therein will be burned up. But it's going to be with fire, of course, as we read about in 2 Peter 3 and other places. But if you pick up there in verse 8, God spake to Noah and his sons with him, saying, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, of every beast of the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark to every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there be any more a flood, neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. And of course the rainbow serves as a reminder. God said, This is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. It's such a shame that some have tried to hijack that great symbol, token of God's covenant with mankind, and turn it into something to represent sin and debauchery. But may we never forget, no matter what somebody tries to do with that, it is forever God's sign. He will never destroy the earth again by a flood. It reminds us God is faithful to his promises. It's interesting because we have noticed since moving to Bremen, every time this happened, Friday maybe? I think it was Friday, or it might have been Thursday. Every time it rains, I think every single time that it has rained since we've been here, when the sun was shining, there will be a rainbow right back over here behind the building. In fact, I've got a picture. Reagan took the picture, but it's the two oldest of our littles, and they're out there one day when there was a double rainbow. Actually, one was the double was real faint, but the other one was one of the brightest rainbows I've ever seen in my life. And the two littles are just like, and they're pointing up at it. It's a really cute picture, but it always, every time I see a rainbow, I'm just amazed at that's just one of those, the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament showeth his handiwork, Psalm 19:1. But also a reminder of God's faithfulness to his promises. More important events in this section. Noah planted a vineyard and he got drunk. Chapter 9, verse 21. Noah began to be a husbandman, verse 20. He planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and was drunken. He was uncovered within his tent. Obviously, this is a reference here to fermented alcoholic wine. This would not be anything probably even of the strength of a lot of what would be considered weaker wine today, but it was intoxicating and he became drunken. Now, I stop here because people have different ideas on this, and sometimes depending on who you read after, some people will say in this particular event, Noah sinned and got drunk. I'm not standing here before you to defend drinking, social drinking or otherwise. I don't think any Christian has any business touching that stuff. Let me stop. Let me correct that. I know, biblically, no child of God has any business even touching that stuff. Nothing good comes from it. But, at least in any kind of social use, there is obviously some medicinal use to it now, which most has been replaced by other things. But I say all this to say, I don't know if he knew what was going to happen. So that's my question. Did he sin? Perhaps. But did he know the effects previously? There's no indication. It says Noah began to be an husbandman. Some commentators say, well, he would have continued this from what he did before the flood, but the text does say he began to be an husbandman. I guess it could mean he began again to be an husbandman. I don't know. Adam Clarke is a well-known Methodist commentator, has been dead for many years. He unfortunately, when you get to the New Testament, has a lot of denominational bias. But on the Old Testament, man, he is sharp. And I still, as old as that commentary is, does anybody know, anybody have any idea when that was published? I bet it's well over 100 years old. 1700s. Wow. Okay. Thank you. I was just kind of sitting here thinking about that, and I've never stopped to check. But that man's knowledge of Hebrew, he just about fluent in Hebrew from what I can tell when you read his writings. He was pretty much fluent in Latin. He'll put stuff in Latin all the time in his commentary, and sometimes he doesn't translate it. And I'm going, hello, I don't speak Latin. But pretty amazing. But he's very adamant that he doesn't believe Noah had any idea what the effects of this were going to be when he drank it. Maybe, maybe not. It's not a big deal. I just pause there to say, be careful. I don't want to. Some people go on and on and say, oh, Noah's such a good man, but here's this, this one blemish on his record. And certainly the Bible doesn't hesitate to record shortcomings, even of its heroes. Abraham, as we'll see in the third period of Old Testament history, is going to lie about Sarah, his wife. Well, she's my sister. She's not my wife, because he's scared that they're going to kill him to take her. David committed adultery, blatant adultery, and then murdered to cover it up. So it's not that the Bible shirks from revealing the flaws of its heroes. That's one of the evidences of inspiration. And it also helps us to understand that even though I make mistakes in my life, I can still be a faithful servant of God. I need to forsake those sins when I commit sin. I need to forsake that, turn away from it, ask God for forgiveness, do what's right. But it doesn't, just because I'm damaged goods doesn't mean I can't be a faithful servant of God. But at the same time, I want to be careful and not speak too soon on something like this. Noah's grandson in chapter 9. This is just on the heels of Noah drinking this wine, whether knowingly or not, he ends up drunken. And verse 21 tells us he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment, they laid it upon both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. Well, Ham he sees his father's nakedness. This is not just he walks in and goes, oh, excuse me, didn't realize there's something here, and it's a word that's used quite a bit. I looked this word up in the Hebrew and did again, you can have just about any free Bible software you can get where you can search and find all the uses of a word in the Old Testament or New, depending on the language. This Hebrew word is used, I think it was well over 100 verses. And sometimes it means gazed upon. Sometimes it means looked. It even has some other secondary meanings, but here very obviously this is something beyond just, he walked in and oops and turned right away. That's happened to a lot of folks before. Maybe you go in, you don't realize somebody's changing, or maybe a door that somebody thought was locked is not, and you walk in and it's awkward, but you just turn right away and say, sorry. That's not what happened here. And that's why there is this curse that is pronounced. And it goes on and says, verse 24, Noah woke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him. Well, somebody says, what had he done unto him? He just looked. Well, no, there's more than that. And he said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. This is fulfilled, and you'll see this later on, when the Canaanites, who were descendants of Canaan, obviously, become the servants of the Israelites, particularly Joshua 9, 23 and 27 with the Gibeonites. who are descendants of Canaan. And you see it again in 1 Kings 9, 20 and 21 with Solomon, making them serve under tribute. The curse here is pronounced on Canaan, the son of Ham. God is using this as an occasion to announce basically what's going to be. This is not a curse that because of the curse, the Canaanites are wicked people. That would be God turning them into wicked people. That would be, unconditional election. I was thinking of the TULIP acronym for Calvinism. But the unconditional election has the idea that God has just made some people to be saved and he's made some people to be lost, and no matter what you want to do, if you're in that lost category, you just can't do anything about it. And yet over and over again, the Bible has Jesus saying, "Come unto me, whosoever will, let him take of the water of life freely." Matthew 11:28, Revelation 22:17. So that can't be right. But what God is revealing to us here is he knows the course of history. And he knows the course that Canaan's descendants are going to take. And so this curse is pronounced, and they're going to serve the Israelites, the descendants of Shem. Who are the Israelites? Israel descended from Shem. You read Genesis 11, 10 through 26, leading up to our introduction to Abraham, and you find out from Shem, Abraham is directly descended. You see this again in the genealogy of 1 Chronicles 21, 24 through 27. All right, important events going on here. God confused the language of all the earth at Babel. You see this in chapter 11, verse 9. He's going to confound or confuse the language there to scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. The people were trying to build a tower to heaven, of course. Why? Well, two primary reasons are given here. They want to make their name great. Chapter 11, verse 4. Instead of trying to lift up and glorify the name of the God of heaven, they want to make their name great. That was a problem. And so that's part of why this happened. But number two is they didn't want to be scattered over all the earth. That's what they said. We don't want to be scattered. And yet what did God say in chapter 9, verse 1? Go and scatter, disperse upon the face of the earth. God says disperse. They say let's build a tower so that we're not dispersed. They're going directly against the will of God. And so God is not just going, well, I think I'll just go down there and mix everything up and confuse everybody. He's not just getting his jollies from confusing the language. They're going in direct disobedience to God. And then, of course, 11, 26 through 29, really, or 26 and 29, we're introduced to Abraham, or Abram and Sarai, as they are at this time. They leave Ur to go to the land of Canaan, chapter 11, verse 31. Some important questions and some lessons here. What is the significance of the rainbow? Well, it's a sign of God's promise never to destroy the earth by flood again. We talked about that. How many people were in the new world? 8 people. Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth. And even I can do 4 times 2. That's 8. They all had wives. 8 people. 1 Peter 3:20 tells us that, by the way, in the New Testament as well. Who are the Canaanites? Descendants of Canaan. Yeah, I was going to say that's not a trick question. Why did they serve Israel? This was the consequence. God, again, knowing the unfolding of history and their behavior, was the consequence of what Ham did, gazing upon his father's nakedness. Why are there different languages? By the way, I think that whole curse against Canaan and his descendants, because of what Ham had done, I think that's another evidence that I tend to lean toward. I don't know that Noah knew what effect this was going to have. If he did, I don't understand how, you don't say, well, what's to be done with Noah, because he just goes and gets drunk. So I think perhaps he didn't know, and in that state, here comes his son upon him, gazing upon his nakedness, maybe mocking, scoffing, I don't know. But it could have been even something unnatural, homosexual about it. I don't know, but something very wrong there. But it seems that Noah is consistently portrayed as innocent there. Why are there different languages? Because God confounded the languages, confused the languages at Babel. So if you ever wonder, why do people speak so many different languages? Well, there's where it all goes back to. Up to that time, there was one language. A lesson we learn here is that man quickly forgets God, turning away soon after the flood. Doesn't take long, does it? Right here in chapter 11, God says disperse. They say, nope, we're going to stay together and we're going to build this tower to heaven. And not only that, we want to do it to make our name great and magnificent. They quickly turned away and forget God. Even Ham's action with the incident there with Noah. Another lesson here is that sin has consequences. You see consequences of sin in the flood, the destruction of the earth. The earth's never been the same since then. You see the consequences of sin, murder. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. I've got 9:6 there. Isn't that 9:7? No, it is 6. You see the consequences of Ham's action, some of that playing out with the descendants of Canaan. You see the consequences of sin in Babel. God said disperse. They didn't want to. God said his name is to be great and glorified. They want to make their name great. The languages are confused, and now there are consequences from the flood. Even murder should be some consequences. It's sometimes not the way it should be, but specifically the flood and Babel have consequences that last even to this day. We still have all these different languages, and it makes it difficult sometimes even when you want to communicate the gospel to somebody. Consequences from the flood. A lot of the seasons, natural disasters and things like that, are most of them a result of the flood. Memory verse for this period. 1 Thessalonians 5:21 and 22. Prove all things, hold fast that which is good. Abstain from all appearance of evil. Literally, abstain from every form of evil. 1 Thessalonians 5:21 and 22. I have a review of period number 1. We're out of time, so what we'll do is we'll pick up next week. First thing, we'll review period number 1. I really wanted to bust it and get through period number 2 today, and I'm glad we did. So we'll review period number 1, jump into period number 3, and then if we have time at the end of that period, I think that one's going to cover more than one class, but whenever we do get to the end of period 3, we'll review period number 2. And when we get to the end of period number 4, we'll review period number 3, and so on like that. So keep that in mind. We'll pick up next week, Lord willing, and we'll begin with a review of the first period of Old Testament history. I have a few handouts for period number 2 if you want them. If I run out, don't worry, I can make copies, or I can email you one, send it to you on Facebook. However, just let me know if you want some of that. And I've got plenty of that material. It's easy to send it electronically or to print it out and make you a hard copy as well. Thank you very much. We'll pick up, as I said, Lord willing, next week with a review of period 1 and then jump into period number 3, the patriarchal period. We'll have a short break before our worship.